The mystic who toppled an empire. The snow fell silently on St. Petersburg that December night in 1916, muffling the sounds of a city at war. Behind the elegant facade of the Yusupov Palace, one of the most dramatic murders in history was unfolding. In the basement, a man lay dying not quickly as his killers had planned, but slowly, fighting for life with an almost supernatural tenacity that would only add to his legend. This was Grigory Rasputin, the man they called the Mad Monk, though he was neither mad nor truly a monk. He was something far more dangerous to the old order, a peasant who had whispered in the ear of an empress, a mystic who had held the fate of an empire in his weathered hands, a man whose very existence had become a symbol of everything wrong with Imperial Russia. As his killers watched in horror, Rasputin's eyes opened one final time, fixing them with a gaze that seemed to see straight through to their souls. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, would later write that those eyes held a green phosphorescent gleam. Even in death, Rasputin commanded attention, demanded explanation, refused to be ordinary. But how had it come to this? How had a barely literate peasant from the remote villages of Siberia risen to such heights of power that Russian nobles felt compelled to murder him to save their empire? How had one man's influence over a royal family become so absolute that his very presence threatened the stability of the world's largest nation? The story of Rasputin is more than just a tale of one extraordinary individual. It is the story of how faith and desperation can blind even the most powerful to the consequences of their choices. It is a story of how personal tragedy can intersect with political catastrophe, how private scandals can topple public institutions, and how the intimate details of family life can reshape the course of history. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, we'll journey back to a time when empires still seemed eternal, when divine right was more than a quaint notion, and when the fate of millions could rest in the hands of a man who claimed to speak directly with God. We'll explore the shadowy world of Imperial Russian politics, where mysticism and power dance together in ballrooms lit by crystal chandeliers, and where the personal became political with devastating consequences. The Russia of the early 20th century was a land of extremes. Glittering palaces stood alongside wretched slums. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 3 centuries, commanded the loyalty of millions, while revolutionary ideas fermented in the underground. It was a world where peasants still kissed the ground their Tsar had walked upon, yet where educated elites plotted the overthrow of the very system that had made their privilege possible. Into this volatile mixture came Grigory Rasputin, carrying with him the earthy wisdom of rural Russia and a magnetic personality that seemed to draw people to him like iron filings to a magnet. He would become the most controversial figure in the final chapter of Imperial Russia, a man whose very name would become synonymous with corruption, excess, and the abuse of power. But to understand how a peasant from Siberia came to hold such sway over the rulers of the world's largest empire, we must journey back to where it all began, to a small village on the edge of the known world, where a young man first discovered that he possessed something that others desperately needed, the ability to heal, to comfort, and to convince others that he held the keys to divine intervention. The making of a holy man. The village of Pokrovskoye lay like a forgotten prayer on the vast Siberian steppe, its wooden houses huddled together against the endless sky. Here, in 1869, in a peasant cottage that differed little from hundreds of others scattered across the Russian wilderness, Grigory Efimovich Rasputin drew his first breath. The name Rasputin, which would one day send shivers through the palaces of St. Petersburg, meant simply the debauched one, a nickname that would prove prophetic in ways his parents could never have imagined. Young Grigory's early years were marked by the kind of wildness that often emerges in children who grow up in vast, untamed landscapes. He was known throughout the village as a troublemaker, a boy who seemed to attract chaos wherever he went. Stories circulated of his involvement in petty thefts, his fondness for drink despite his youth, and his seemingly magnetic effect on the village girls. His father, Ephraim, was a prosperous peasant by local standards, owning horses and land that even relative wealth could not contain his son's restless spirit. The turning point in young Rasputin's life came, according to his own later accounts, when he was in his late teens. While working in the fields, he claimed to have experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary, who spoke to him of his destiny as a healer and holy man. Whether this vision was genuine religious experience, the product of a young man's overwrought imagination, or simply a convenient story he later invented, it marked the beginning of his transformation from village troublemaker to wandering mystic. Rasputin began to frequent the local monastery, spending hours in prayer and study, but his interpretation of religious devotion was uniquely his own. He became fascinated with the idea that one must sin greatly in order to repent greatly, a doctrine that would later fuel both his appeal and the scandals that surrounded him. This belief, which had roots in certain Russian mystical traditions, would become central to his personal philosophy, that through experiencing the depths of human weakness, one could achieve a more profound understanding of divine mercy. The young man's magnetic personality began to manifest itself in these early years of religious seeking. Villagers noticed that he seemed to possess an uncanny ability to calm agitated animals, to soothe crying children, and to offer comfort to those in distress. His eyes, which many described as extraordinarily penetrating, seemed to hold a hypnotic quality that drew people to him despite his rough peasant origins. As Rasputin entered his 20s, he made the decision that would set him on the path to infamy. He became a strannik, a wandering holy man. These religious pilgrims were a common sight in Russia, traveling from monastery to monastery, from shrine to shrine, seeking spiritual enlightenment through physical hardship and geographical displacement. For Rasputin, this wandering period would last several years and would take him as far as the Holy Land. During his travels, Rasputin encountered various mystical groups and religious sects that operated on the margins of official Russian orthodoxy. Most controversial among these was his alleged connection to the Klisti, a secretive sect that practiced ecstatic religious rituals involving singing, dancing, and, according to their critics, sexual license. The Klisti believed that through extreme emotional and physical experiences, one could achieve direct communion with the divine. Whether Rasputin was ever formally a member of this group remains historically uncertain, but the accusations would follow him throughout his life and contribute significantly to the scandals that would eventually engulf the royal family. What is certain is that during these wandering years, Rasputin developed the persona and the practices that would later make him famous. He cultivated a deliberately unkempt appearance, allowing his hair and beard to grow long and wild, and adopting the rough clothing of a peasant holy man. He developed a way of speaking that combined folksy wisdom with religious mysticism, using simple language to express complex spiritual ideas in ways that common people could understand and appreciate. More importantly, he began to develop his reputation as a healer. Stories began to circulate of miraculous cures he had performed, of his ability to calm the minds of the troubled and to ease the sufferings of the afflicted. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, but enough genuine cases of his apparently successful interventions occurred to build a solid foundation for his growing reputation. The mechanisms of Rasputin's healing abilities remain a subject of debate among historians and medical professionals. Some suggest that he possessed a natural talent for hypnosis, using his penetrating gaze and soothing voice to induce a state of relaxation that could alleviate certain psychological and psychosomatic ailments. Others point to his genuine empathy and his ability to provide the kind of focused attention and emotional support that could indeed have therapeutic effects. What cannot be disputed is that by the time Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoye in the early 1900s, he had transformed himself from a village troublemaker into a figure of considerable local renown. Pilgrims began to seek him out, traveling considerable distances to consult with the peasant holy man who is said to possess extraordinary spiritual gifts. His own home became a kind of informal shrine where visitors would gather to hear his teachings and to seek his blessing. But Rasputin's ambitions extended far beyond his small village. He had tasted the intoxicating mixture of spiritual authority and popular acclaim, and he hungered for a larger stage on which to exercise his gifts. The stories he had heard during his travels of holy men who had gained access to the highest circles of Russian society captured his imagination. He began to dream of bringing his particular brand of peasant mysticism to the very heart of the empire. The opportunity came through a network of religious enthusiasts and society ladies who moved between St. Petersburg's glittering salons and its various mystical circles. In the early 1900s, there was a growing fascination among the Russian elite with spiritualism, mysticism, and alternative religious practices. This fascination was partly a reaction to the rapid social and political changes that were transforming Russian society, and partly a reflection of the broader European interest in the occult that characterized the fin de siècle period. Through a series of introductions and recommendations, Rasputin's reputation began to precede him to the capital. Stories of the Siberian holy man's healing powers circulated in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, passed along by believers and skeptics alike. It was only a matter of time before these stories reached the ears of those closest to the imperial family, setting in motion the events that would make Rasputin one of the most controversial figures in Russian history. In 1903, Rasputin made his first journey to St. Petersburg, arriving in the capital like a primitive force of nature transplanted into the refined world of imperial society. His impact was immediate and polarizing. To some, he appeared as a genuine holy man, a living connection to the deep spiritual traditions of the Russian people. To others, he seemed a crude imposter, a peasant charlatan who had somehow managed to infiltrate civilized society. But it was not the opinions of society ladies or religious intellectuals that would determine Rasputin's fate. His destiny lay in the hands of a royal family facing a crisis that all their wealth, power, and privilege could not solve, a crisis that would make them desperate enough to place their trust in a wild man from Siberia who claimed to speak directly with God. Enter the royal family, a dynasty in crisis in the gleaming halls of the Winter Palace. Behind walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of Romanov rule, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, was a man never meant to rule. Slight in stature, gentle in disposition, and more comfortable in the intimate circle of his family than in the grand theater of imperial politics. Nicholas had inherited a throne he was ill-equipped to occupy, and an empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern. The weight of autocracy sat uneasily on his shoulders. Unlike his towering father, Alexander III, who had ruled with an iron fist and supreme confidence in his divine right, Nicholas often seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of his responsibilities. He was a devoted husband and father, a man of simple pleasures who would have been far happier as a country gentleman than as the ruler of 1/6 of the world's Iceland surface. But fate and birth had made him Tsar, and he approached his duties with a mixture of genuine dedication and private anguish. His wife, Alexandra Fedorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, had come to Russia as a young bride filled with romantic notions about her adopted country and her role as Empress. Beautiful, intelligent, and deeply religious, Alexandra had converted to Russian Orthodoxy with the fervor of a true believer. But her German origins made her suspect among many Russians, particularly as tensions with Germany began to escalate in the years before, World War I, Alexandra's personality was in many ways the opposite of what Russian society expected from an empress. Where previous Romanov consorts had been socially graceful and politically astute, Alexandra was shy, awkward in social situations, and prone to intense, exclusive friendships. She preferred the company of a small circle of intimate friends to the elaborate court ceremonies that were such an important part of imperial life. This social reluctance was often interpreted as arrogance or disdain for Russian society, further alienating her from the very people she needed to charm. The early years of Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage were marked by happiness tinged with growing anxiety. They had produced 4 daughters in succession: Olga, Tatyana, Maria, and Anastasia, but no male heir. In the complex world of imperial succession, this was more than a personal disappointment. It was a political crisis. The absence of a direct male heir raised questions about the stability of the dynasty and provided ammunition for those who questioned Nicholas's fitness to rule. Then, in 1904, their prayers appeared to be answered with the birth of Alexei Nikolaevich, the long-awaited heir to the throne. The joy of the imperial couple knew no bounds. Here, at last, was the son who would carry on the Romanov name and ensure the continuity of the dynasty. The birth was celebrated throughout the empire with special services, public festivities, and expressions of loyalty to the crown, but their joy was short-lived. Within months of Alexei's birth, it became apparent that the young Tsarevich suffered from hemophilia, the hereditary bleeding disorder that had plagued several European royal families. In an era before modern medical treatments, hemophilia was often a death sentence. The slightest injury could trigger internal bleeding that doctors were powerless to stop. Bruises became life-threatening emergencies, and normal childhood activities became impossible dangers. The discovery of Alexei's condition plunged the imperial family into a private hell of anxiety and secrecy. Hemophilia was not well understood by the general public, and the imperial couple feared that knowledge of their heir's illness would be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or dynastic weakness. They made the decision to keep the severity of Alexei's condition secret from all but their most trusted advisors, a choice that would have profound consequences for the future of their dynasty. Alexandra, in particular, was devastated by her son's illness. As the carrier of the gene that had caused his condition, she blamed herself for his suffering. Her guilt was compounded by her helplessness in the face of his pain. During his bleeding episodes, she would sit by his bedside for days and nights, watching her child writhe in agony while the best doctors in the empire stood by, unable to provide meaningful relief. The strain of living with this constant anxiety began to take its toll on both parents, but especially on Alexandra. She became increasingly reclusive, canceling public appearances and social obligations to remain close to her son. Her already difficult relationship with Russian society deteriorated further as she was criticized for her apparent lack of interest in her imperial duties. Few understood that her seeming indifference to court life was actually the result of her overwhelming preoccupation with her son's health. It was into this atmosphere of desperation and secrecy that Anna Verbova entered the imperial circle. A plump, enthusiastic young woman from a respectable St. Petersburg family, Anna had become Alexandra's closest friend and confidant. Despite her apparent simplicity, critics often described her as intellectually limited. Anna possessed an intuitive understanding of Alexandra's emotional needs and a boundless devotion to the imperial family. Anna was also deeply religious and had a fascination with mysticism and spiritualism that was characteristic of many in her social circle. She moved easily between the glittering world of St. Petersburg society and the shadowy realm of holy men, faith healers, and religious enthusiasts who clustered around the edges of respectable society. It was through Anna that various mystics and healers gained access to the imperial family during these desperate years. Before Rasputin, there had been others. A succession of holy men, healers, and religious advisors had been brought to the palace, each promising relief for the suffering child and peace for his tormented parents. Some were obvious charlatans, quickly exposed and dismissed. Others seemed to possess genuine healing abilities, but proved unable to provide lasting help for Alexei's condition. Each failure only deepened the imperial couple's desperation and made them more willing to try increasingly unconventional approaches. The imperial family's openness to mystical healers was not unusual by the standards of their time and social position. Throughout European royal circles, there was a long tradition of consulting with religious figures and healers, particularly in cases where conventional medicine had failed. The isolation and pressure of royal life often made rulers susceptible to the claims of those who promised access to supernatural assistance. But in Russia, this tradition took on particular intensity. Russian Orthodoxy had always maintained a strong mystical component, with its emphasis on miraculous icons, holy relics, and the intercession of saints. The figure of the holy man, the starets, occupied a special place in Russian religious culture. These spiritual advisors were believed to possess special insights into the divine will and were often consulted by believers from all levels of society. For Alexandra, who had embraced Russian Orthodoxy with the passion of a convert, the idea of seeking help from a holy man was not only acceptable but almost mandatory. If God had afflicted her son with this terrible illness, then surely God could also provide the means for his healing. Her faith demanded that she explore every possible avenue for divine intervention, no matter how unconventional it might appear to outsiders. Nicholas, though more skeptical by nature, was willing to support his wife's desperate search for help. He loved his son deeply and was willing to try anything that might alleviate the boy's suffering. Moreover, he understood the political implications of Alexei's illness better than Alexandra did. If the heir to the throne died young or proved unable to rule due to his condition, the stability of the entire dynasty could be threatened. The stage was thus set for the arrival of Grigory Rasputin and the desperate search for someone who could help their afflicted son, Nicholas. And Alexandra had become willing to place their trust in anyone who demonstrated even the slightest ability to provide relief. They had already compromised their dignity and exposed themselves to potential scandal by consulting with various mystics and healers. What was one more peasant holy man in this parade of spiritual advisors? But Rasputin would prove to be different from all the others. Where previous healers had failed, he would appear to succeed. Where others had promised much and delivered little, he would demonstrate a seemingly miraculous ability to calm the suffering child and ease his parents' fears. In their desperation, Nicholas and Alexandra would not question too closely the source of his apparent powers or the price they might eventually have to pay for his help. The introduction came through Anna Verbova, who had heard whispered accounts of the Siberian holy man's remarkable abilities. In the autumn of 1905, as Alexei was recovering from a particularly severe bleeding episode, Anna suggested that the imperial couple might benefit from consulting with this unusual spiritual advisor. Exhausted by their son's suffering and their own helplessness, Nicholas and Alexandra agreed to meet with the man who called himself a simple peasant from Pokrovskoye. Thus began one of the most controversial relationships in the history of the Russian imperial family. Association that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of a dynasty that had seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the Russian winter itself. The healing touch, Rasputin's hold over the royal family. The first meeting between Rasputin and the imperial family took place in the elegant salon of Anna Vyrybova's modest palace apartments in November 1905. The contrast could hardly have been more striking. On one side, the refined, beautifully dressed representatives of European royalty. On the other, a wild-haired peasant in simple clothes, who carried with him the earthy sense of rural Russia and an aura of barely contained primitive energy. Alexandra later described her first impression of Rasputin in terms that revealed both her desperation and her immediate fascination with this unusual man. She noted his extraordinary eyes pale blue and extraordinarily penetrating, which seemed to look straight through to her soul. His voice, she observed, was surprisingly gentle for such a physically imposing man, and when he spoke of spiritual matters, his words carried a conviction that was both comforting and compelling. Rasputin, for his part, seemed entirely comfortable in the presence of royalty. Unlike other visitors to the palace who were typically overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings and the awesome presence of the Tsar and Tsarina, he behaved with a natural ease that was both refreshing and slightly shocking to his hosts. He addressed them not with the elaborate formalities of court protocol, but with the simple directness of a spiritual advisor speaking to fellow believers. During this first encounter, Rasputin demonstrated the techniques that would make him indispensable to the imperial family. He spoke to Alexandra about her son's condition with a certainty that was both reassuring and mysterious. Without having examined Alexei or even having been told the specific nature of his illness, Rasputin declared that the child would recover from his current crisis and that God had sent him to provide comfort and healing to the imperial family. More remarkable still was his apparent ability to sense the deep emotional currents that ran beneath the formal surface of imperial life. He spoke to Alexandra about her guilt and anxiety regarding her son's condition, addressing fears and feelings that she had shared with no one except her husband. His words seemed to offer not just hope for Alexei's physical healing, but emotional healing for parents who had been tormented by their sense of helplessness. The real test of Rasputin's abilities came during his first encounter with Alexei himself. The 8-year-old Tsarevich was recovering from a bleeding episode that had left him weak and bedridden. The imperial doctors had done what little they could, but the child remained in considerable discomfort, and his parents feared that any sudden movement or excitement might trigger another dangerous hemorrhage. When Rasputin entered the child's sick room, his presence seemed to transform the atmosphere immediately. Where there had been tension and anxiety, a strange calm descended. Alexei, who had been restless and fretful, became quiet and attentive. Rasputin approached the bed slowly, his movements deliberate and soothing, and began to speak to the child in a low, rhythmic voice. What happened next would be described differently by various witnesses, but all agreed that something extraordinary occurred. Rasputin placed his hands on the child's head and began to pray, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence that seemed to fill the room with a peculiar energy. Alexei's breathing became deeper and more regular. His face lost its pinched expression of pain, and within minutes, he had fallen into what appeared to be the first peaceful sleep he had enjoyed in days. The immediate effect on Nicholas and Alexandra was profound. Here at last was someone who seemed able to provide genuine relief for their son's suffering. Where the most distinguished doctors in Europe had been reduced to helpless observation, this simple peasant had apparently succeeded in easing the child's distress with nothing more than prayer and the laying on of hands. Over the following months, Rasputin was called to the palace whenever Alexei experienced a health crisis. Each time, his intervention seemed to produce remarkable results. The child's bleeding would stop, his pain would subside, and he would sink into restorative sleep. The imperial couple began to view these apparent miracles as divine intervention, sent in answer to their desperate prayers. The mechanisms behind Rasputin's apparent healing abilities remain a subject of intense debate among historians and medical professionals. Some suggest that his success was largely psychological, both for the child and his parents. Alexei, who had learned to associate medical intervention with pain and anxiety, may have found Rasputin's gentle, non-medical approach genuinely comforting. The peasant holy man's confidence and calm may have helped to reduce the stress and agitation that could exacerbate bleeding episodes. Others point to the possibility that Rasputin possessed genuine hypnotic abilities that could help to manage pain and promote relaxation. His penetrating gaze, rhythmic speech patterns, and ability to maintain intense focus on his subjects were all characteristics associated with successful hypnotists. In an era before modern pain management techniques, such abilities could indeed have therapeutic value. There is also the controversial theory that Rasputin's success was partly due to his willingness to countermand the advice of the imperial physicians. Some medical historians have suggested that certain treatments prescribed by the court doctors, including aspirin, which can increase bleeding, may have actually worsened Alexei's condition. By providing an alternative to conventional medical treatment, Rasputin may have inadvertently helped the child by allowing his body's natural healing processes to work without interference. Whatever the explanation for his apparent success, Rasputin's growing influence over the imperial family was undeniable. Alexandra, in particular, became convinced that he had been sent by God specifically to preserve her son's life and, by extension, the future of the Romanov dynasty. She began to see him not merely as a healer, but as a prophet whose insights into the divine will extend far beyond medical matters. This expanded role was evident in the increasingly frequent consultations between Rasputin and the imperial couple on matters ranging from personal decisions to affairs of state. Alexandra would often turn to him for advice on everything from the selection of tutors for her children to the appointment of government ministers. His opinions, delivered with the same confidence he displayed in matters of healing, began to carry significant weight in the private councils of the imperial family. The relationship between Rasputin and Alexandra was particularly intense and would become the source of endless speculation and scandal. The Serena's dependence on the peasant holy man went far beyond the practical matter of her son's health care. She seemed to find in Rasputin something that was missing from her life, as Empress, a spiritual advisor who spoke to her not as a subject to a sovereign, but as one believer to another. In their private conversations, conducted in the informal atmosphere of Anna Vyrabova's apartments, or in the family quarters of the palace, Alexandra would pour out her fears, doubts, and spiritual longings to this unlikely confidant. Rasputin, in turn, provided the kind of emotional support and spiritual guidance that her position as Empress made it difficult for her to find elsewhere. He told her that her sufferings as a mother were a mark of divine favor, that God had chosen her family for special trials because of their special destiny. Nicholas's relationship with Rasputin was more complex and ambivalent. While he was grateful for the apparent help the holy man provided to his son, he was also acutely aware of the potential political dangers of their association. As Tsar, he understood better than his wife how their reliance on such an unconventional advisor might be perceived by their subjects and by foreign observers. Yet Nicholas found himself gradually drawn into Rasputin's orbit, partly out of loyalty to his wife, and partly because he too was impressed by the peasant's aspiring abilities. During family crises, when Alexei's condition was particularly grave, the Tsar would join his wife in seeking Rasputin's counsel and comfort. In these moments of extreme stress, the carefully maintained barriers between sovereign and subject would dissolve, and the imperial couple would reveal themselves as desperate parents willing to try anything to save their child. Rasputin's behavior during these intimate family consultations was a masterful blend of mystical authority and folksy warmth. He would arrive at the palace carrying with him the earthy sense of the Russian countryside, speaking in the simple, direct language of the peasantry, yet radiating a confidence in his spiritual powers that impressed even sophisticated observers. He had an uncanny ability to read the emotional needs of his audience and to provide exactly the kind of reassurance and guidance they were seeking. With Alexei, he was playful and affectionate, treating the future Tsar not as a sacred personage, but as any beloved child. He would tell the boy stories of his adventures in Siberia, play simple games with him, and speak to him about the mysteries of faith and language that a child could understand. For Alexei, who lived a heavily protected and formal existence these interactions with, Rasputin represented some of his few opportunities to experience the easy, uncomplicated affection of an adult who made no demands upon him except that he get well. The Mad Monk's Wild Nights. Debauchery in St. Petersburg, as Rasputin's influence within the imperial palace grew, so too did his notoriety in the glittering salons and shadowy underworld of St. Petersburg. The contrast between his holy mission at court and his nocturnal adventures in the capital as most disreputable establishments would become one of the defining paradoxes of his extraordinary life. By day, he was the pious healer ministering to the imperial family. By night, he was something altogether different, a figure of such scandalous success that his very name became synonymous with debauchery. The transformation was as dramatic as it was disturbing to those who witnessed it. The same man who would spend hours in prayer with the Serena, who would gently comfort the suffering Alexei with paternal tenderness, would emerge from the palace to embark on drinking bouts of legendary proportions. His capacity for alcohol was superhuman, according to contemporary accounts. He could consume quantities of vodka that would have filled ordinary men, yet remain coherent enough to engage in complex conversations about politics, religion, or any other subject that caught his fancy. Rasputin's headquarters for these nocturnal adventures was a spacious apartment he maintained on Gorokovaya Street, in one of St. Petersburg's more respectable neighborhoods. The Villa Road, as it came to be known, was a study in contradictions that perfectly reflected its occupant's dual nature. The main reception room was furnished with expensive furniture and decorated with religious icons and photographs of the imperial family, creating an atmosphere that was part shrine, part salon. Yet visitors to this room would often find themselves witnessing scenes that seemed to belong more in a tavern than in the residence of a holy man. The apartment served multiple functions in Rasputin's complex social ecology. During daylight hours, it was a place of pilgrimage where believers would come to seek his blessing, his prayers, or his advice on spiritual matters. Peasants from his native Siberia would make the long journey to St. Petersburg, specifically to consult with their famous countrymen. Society ladies would arrive in elegant carriages, carefully veiled to avoid recognition, seeking guidance on matters ranging from family troubles to affairs of the heart. But as evening fell, the character of the Villa Road would undergo a dramatic transformation. The religious pilgrims and society ladies would depart, replaced by a very different crowd of visitors. Actresses from the imperial theaters would arrive, drawn by curiosity about the notorious holy man, and perhaps by the prospect of gaining access to the highest circles of society through his influence. Government officials would appear, some seeking to curry favor with the man who was known to have the Serena's ear, others hoping to learn state secrets that might advance their careers. Most notorious of all were the women who became regular fixtures at these gatherings. They came from all levels of St. Petersburg society board aristocrats seeking excitement, middle-class wives looking for escape from conventional domesticity, and professionals from the city's thriving entertainment industry. What they found at Rasputin's apartment was a peculiar form of liberation from the strict social conventions that governed their daily lives. Rasputin's treatment of these female visitors was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. He had developed a philosophy that combined elements of Russian mysticism with his own interpretation of human sexuality, creating a doctrine that was both appealing and dangerous to women trapped in the restrictive social roles of early 20th century Russia. His central thesis was that spiritual salvation could only be achieved through a complete understanding of human sin. To truly appreciate divine grace, he argued, one must first experience the full depths of human degradation. This doctrine, which had roots in certain Christian mystical traditions, became in Rasputin's hands a justification for behavior that would have scandalized conventional society. The evening gatherings at the Villa Road would typically begin with dinner, featuring the heavy, rustic fare that Rasputin preferred. He would regale his guests with stories of his travels, his encounters with various holy men and mystics, and his insights into the spiritual life. His conversation was earthy, direct, and often shocking to refined sensibilities, but it possessed the vitality and authenticity that many of his listeners found intoxicating. As the alcohol flowed in Rasputin was legendary for his ability to consume vast quantities while remaining apparently unaffected. The atmosphere would become increasingly charged. The holy man would begin to expound on his theories about the relationship between physical and spiritual experience, using language that became progressively more explicit as the evening wore on. His hands, which had been described as possessing healing powers when he ministered to the young Alezai, took on a different character entirely in these social settings. Female visitors would later describe how Rasputin would place these same hands upon them, claiming to be able to sense their spiritual condition through physical contact. These examinations, conducted with an intensity that was both mesmerizing and disturbing, often progressed far beyond what conventional morality would have considered appropriate. Yet many of the women who experienced these encounters described them not as violations but as spiritual awakenings. Rasputin possessed an extraordinary ability to make his subjects feel that they were participating in something sacred rather than scandalous. He would speak to them in language that combined religious ecstasy with sensual appreciation, creating an atmosphere in which normal moral boundaries seemed not to apply. The most scandalous of these gatherings took place in the ornate bathhouses that were a traditional feature of Russian social life. Rasputin would rent entire establishments for private parties that combined the ritual cleansing associated with these traditional baths with his own unique form of spiritual instruction. These events, which could last for hours, were attended by some of the most prominent women in St. Petersburg society, all drawn by the promise of experiencing something that was simultaneously forbidden and holy. Witnesses to these bathhouse gatherings described scenes that seemed to belong more to the ancient world of religious mystery cults than to 20th century Christian society. Rasputin would lead his followers in prayers and hymns while they bathed together, creating an atmosphere of religious fervor that somehow legitimized behavior that would have been considered outrageously improper in any other context. His personal charisma was particularly powerful in these intimate settings. Stripped of the conventional markers of social status clothing, jewelry, makeup, his followers found themselves in a state of psychological as well as physical nakedness that made them extraordinarily susceptible to his influence. He would move among them like some primitive priest, offering blessings, spiritual guidance, and physical comfort with an authority that seemed to derive from sources beyond the merely human. The stories that emerged from these gatherings were sufficiently shocking to titillate all of St. Petersburg society, yet sufficiently ambiguous to prevent definitive moral judgment. Rasputin's defenders could argue that he was simply following ancient traditions of religious ecstasy and spiritual communion. His critics could point to the same evidence as proof of his fundamental corruption and his abuse of religious authority. Outside the controlled environment of his apartment in the bathhouses, Rasputin's nocturnal adventures took him into the deepest recesses of St. Petersburg's underworld. He was a familiar figure in the city's most disreputable taverns, where he would arrive accompanied by whatever entourage he had collected during the evening's earlier activities. His appearance in these establishments would typically cause a sensation, as working-class patrons found themselves drinking alongside the man who was rumored to control the destiny of the empire. In these rougher surroundings, Rasputin's peasant origins served him well. He could match any tavern patron drink for drink, story for story, and song for song. His ability to relate to people from all social backgrounds was one of his most remarkable characteristics, and in the democratic atmosphere of the tavern, he found an outlet for aspects of his personality that had no place in the refined world of the palace. His drinking companions in these establishments included some of the most colorful characters in the capital: musicians, artists, revolutionaries, criminals, and adventurers of every description. They were drawn to him partly by curiosity about his famous connections, but also by his genuine appreciation for their company. Unlike most members of the elite, who viewed the working classes with a mixture of fear and condescension, Rasputin treated these men and women as equals, sharing with them not only drinks but also confidences about his life and work. These tavern conversations were another source of scandal, as Rasputin's tongues, loosened by alcohol, would sometimes reveal details about his relationship with the imperial family that should have remained strictly confidential. He would boast about his influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, describe his encounters with government ministers, and offer his opinions on matters of state policy. These indiscretions, reported and embellished by his drinking companions, contributed significantly to the growing rumors about his political influence and the extent of his control over the royal family. Perhaps most damaging of all were his expeditions to Moscow's famous Gypsy Quarter, where he would spend days at a time in the company of the musicians and dancers who made that district one of the most exotic and notorious entertainment areas in the empire. The gypsy musicians, with their passionate performances and their reputation for living outside conventional moral boundaries, seemed to represent everything that Rasputin found appealing about life beyond the constraints of respectable society. His behavior during these Moscow adventures became the stuff of legend. Witnesses described orgies of eating, drinking, and dancing that would continue for days without interruption. Rasputin would commandeer entire restaurants, ordering lavish feasts for dozens of guests while demanding that the musicians play continuously. He would dance with a wild abandon that shocked even the uninhibited gypsy performers, his long hair flying as he spun and leaped with seemingly inexhaustible energy. These Moscow expeditions were made possible by his growing wealth, which derived both from the gifts he received from grateful petitioners and from his increasing involvement in various business schemes. As his political influence grew, entrepreneurs began to seek his endorsement for their projects, offering him substantial payments for his support with government officials. This commercialization of his influence was yet another source of scandal, as critics argued that he was selling access to the imperial family for personal profit. The gypsy musicians who became his regular companions during these expeditions provided some of the most detailed and colorful accounts of his private behavior. They described a man who seemed to contain multiple personalities, capable of switching instantly from profound religious meditation to wild sensual indulgence. They noted his extraordinary stamina, his ability to function on almost no sleep, and his apparently inexhaustible appetite for every form of human experience. Yet even in his most abandoned moments, Rasputin never completely abandoned his religious persona. He would interrupt drinking bouts to lead impromptu prayer sessions, would bless his companions, even as he led them into increasingly scandalous behavior, and would speak of divine love, while engaging in activities that conventional morality would have condemned as sinful. This ability to maintain his religious authority, even while violating conventional religious teachings, was perhaps his most remarkable psychological achievement. The cumulative effect of these nocturnal adventures was to create around Rasputin an aura of scandal that grew more lurid with each retelling. By 1910, there was hardly a person in St. Petersburg society who had not heard stories about the holy man's outrageous behavior. These stories, passed from salon to salon, embellished with each telling, created a legend that was probably far more extreme than the reality. yet which contained enough truth to be fundamentally damaging to Rasputin's reputation and, by extension, to the imperial family that continued to rely upon his services. The most disturbing aspect of these scandals was not their content, shocking though it was, but their publicity. In a society where discretion was considered one of the highest virtues, Rasputin's flagrant disregard for conventional propriety made him a lightning rod for criticism. His behavior provided the perfect ammunition for those who wished to attack the imperial family without directly challenging the institution of monarchy itself. Rumors and scandals, the Tsarina's dark friend, as Rasputin's nocturnal escapades became the talk of St. Petersburg society, a more sinister set of rumors began to circulate about the nature of his relationship with the imperial family, particularly with Tsarina Alexandra. These whispers, born from a toxic combination of genuine observation, malicious speculation, and deliberate political sabotage, would prove more damaging to the Romanov dynasty than any military defeat or economic crisis. The rumors centered on what critics called the unnaturally close relationship between the Empress and her spiritual advisor. Society gossips noted the frequency of Rasputin's visits to the palace, the length of his private consultations with Alexandra, and the obvious deference she showed to his opinions on matters far removed from his supposed area of expertise. In the hothouse atmosphere of court society, where every gesture was analyzed for hidden meaning, these observations provided fertile ground for the most scandalous interpretations. The whispers began subtly, as they always do in sophisticated circles. At elegant dinner parties and exclusive social gatherings, guests would exchange meaningful glances when Rasputin's name was mentioned. Conversations would pause when certain topics were raised, only to resume in lower tones once the speakers were certain they could not be overheard. The very restraint with which these early rumors were shared only served to make them more tantalizing and, ultimately, more believable. The physical appearance of both protagonists contributed significantly to the scandal. Alexandra, despite being the mother of 5 children and approaching middle age, remained a strikingly beautiful woman. Her tall, elegant figure, her expressive eyes, and her naturally regal bearing made her an object of fascination for both men and women. Rasputin, for his part, possessed a raw, primitive magnetism that was the antithesis of refined aristocratic masculinity. The contrast between the refined Empress and the wild holy man seemed to suggest possibilities that shocked even sophisticated observers. More damaging still were the increasingly frequent reports of their private meetings. Out of Verbova's apartments, where many of these consultations took place, became the subject of intense speculation. Servants' gossip, filtered through multiple levels of society, described scenes of extraordinary intimacy between the Empress and her advisor. They spoke of hours-long conversations conducted in low, intense voices, of tears and emotional exchanges that seemed inappropriate between a sovereign and her subject. The most scandalous allegations concerned the supposed physical nature of their relationship, drawing on the well-documented accounts of Rasputin's behavior with other women. His critics suggested that his influence over Alexandra was based on the same combination of spiritual manipulation and sexual dominance that he had apparently exercised over his other female followers. The idea that the Empress of all the Russias might have succumbed to the crude advances of a peasant holy man was so shocking that it seemed almost irresistible to those who wished to believe the worst about their rulers. These sexual rumors were given additional credibility by the broader pattern of Rasputin's known behavior. His nighttime adventures, his association with women from all levels of society, and his own boasts about his sexual prowess created a context in which his critics' most extreme allegations seemed plausible. If he could seduce society ladies and actresses, the reasoning went, why not an empress as well? The political implications of these rumors were immediately apparent to those who understood the mechanics of Russian court society. If the Empress was indeed under Rasputin's sexual influence, then her judgment in matters of state could be considered fatally compromised. Every policy decision, every ministerial appointment, every political initiative could be seen as potentially motivated by her personal relationship with her supposed lover rather than by rational consideration of the empire as needs. Nicholas II's reaction to these growing rumors became itself a subject of speculation. Some observers interpreted his apparent tolerance of Rasputin's continued presence as evidence of the Tsar's weakness and his inability to control his own household. Others suggested that he was himself under Rasputin's influence, perhaps through some form of mystical manipulation that rendered him incapable of seeing the truth about his wife's relationship with the holy man. More charitable observers suggested that Nicholas was simply a devoted husband who was willing to tolerate any arrangement that seemed to provide comfort to his troubled wife. They pointed to the genuine affection that clearly existed between the imperial couple and argued that the Tsar's continued support for Rasputin reflected his understanding of his wife's desperate need for spiritual guidance during their son's health crises. But even this more sympathetic interpretation raised troubling questions about the emperor's fitness to rule. If Nicholas was indeed motivated primarily by concern for his wife's emotional well-being, rather than by consideration of the empire's political needs, then his judgment in matters of state could be seen as fundamentally compromised. A ruler who placed personal considerations above public duty was, by definition, a weak ruler. The rumors were particularly damaging because they drew on authentic cultural tensions within Russian society. The relationship between Rasputin and Alexandra seemed to embody everything that conservative Russians found threatening about the modern world. Here was a foreign-born empress, a German princess who had never fully integrated into Russian society, apparently under the influence of a peasant who represented the most primitive and uncontrolled aspects of Russian spirituality. The sexual nature of the alleged relationship was particularly offensive to traditional Russian sensibilities. The Orthodox Church placed enormous emphasis on sexual purity, particularly for women in positions of authority and responsibility. The idea that the Empress might be engaging in an adulterous relationship was not merely personally scandalous, but also religiously and politically subversive. These religious concerns were amplified by Rasputin's own controversial spiritual practices. His association with various mystical sects, particularly the rumored connection to the Quisti, provided his critics with additional ammunition for their attacks. If Rasputin was indeed a member of a sect that practiced sexual license as a form of religious expression, then his influence over the Empress took on even more sinister implications. The international dimensions of the scandal added another layer of complexity to the situation. Alexandra's German origins, which had always made her suspect in the eyes of many Russians, became even more problematic as tensions with Germany escalated in the years before World War I. Critics suggested that her relationship with Rasputin was part of a broader pattern of foreign influence over Russian policy, a suggestion that would become particularly damaging once the war began. Foreign diplomats and journalists, who had their own reasons for wanting to discredit the Russian government, seized upon the Rasputin scandal as evidence of the fundamental corruption and incompetence of the Tsarist regime. Their reports, published in newspapers throughout Europe and America, spread the most lurid details of the alleged relationship to an international audience, creating a public relations disaster for the Russian Empire. This scandal was particularly damaging because it seemed to confirm every negative stereotype about Russian political culture. To foreign observers, the idea that the world's largest empire was being governed by an empress under the sexual influence of a drunken peasant seemed to represent the ultimate degradation of autocratic government. The scandal provided perfect propaganda for those who argued that Russia was too backward, and corrupt to be treated as an equal by the civilized nations of Europe. Within Russia itself, the rumors about Alexandra and Rasputin became a rallying point for various opposition groups. Liberals, who had long criticized the autocratic system, could point to the scandal as evidence of the fundamental corruption of monarchical government. Conservatives, who might otherwise have supported the crown, found themselves in the impossible position of having to defend what appeared to be indefensible behavior by their sovereign. Religious leaders were particularly disturbed by the scandal, which seemed to represent a mockery of everything they held sacred. The idea that a holy man was using his religious authority to gain sexual access to the Empress was offensive not only on moral grounds, but also because it threatened to bring the entire institution of religious guidance into disrepute. Many Orthodox clergy began to distance themselves from Rasputin, despite his apparent influence at court. The most sophisticated critics of the regime understood that the truth or falsehood of the sexual allegations was, in many ways, irrelevant. The mere existence of such widespread and detailed rumors was itself a form of political catastrophe. In a system that depended on the moral authority and popular respect of the ruler, the persistence of such scandalous stories was inherently destabilizing, regardless of their factual basis. This understanding led to some of the most damaging attacks on the imperial family. Rather than simply repeating the sexual allegations, sophisticated critics focused on the broader question of imperial judgment. Why, they asked, would a wise ruler maintain a relationship that was so obviously damaging to the crown's reputation? Even if the sexual allegations were false, the very fact that they were believable suggested a fundamental failure of political wisdom on the part of Nicholas and Alexandra. The cumulative effect of these rumors and scandals was to create an atmosphere of crisis around the imperial family that would only deepen as external pressures mounted. By 1914, when Russia entered World War I, the Rasputin scandal had already severely damaged the moral authority of the crown and created a climate of suspicion and speculation that would make effective governance increasingly difficult. The tragedy was that much of the scandal was based on misunderstanding and misinterpretation of a relationship that was, in reality, far more innocent than its critics alleged. But in the complex world of early 20th century politics, perception was often more important than reality. And the perception surrounding Rasputin and Alexandra would prove to be among the most destructive forces in the final chapter of the Romanov dynasty. World War and political disaster. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 should have provided an opportunity for the Russian imperial family to restore their damaged reputation through patriotic leadership and shared sacrifice. Instead, the war years became the period when Rasputin's influence reached its most destructive peak, and when the scandals surrounding his relationship with the royal family began to have direct and catastrophic effects on the governance of the empire. The early months of the war initially seemed to offer hope for national unity. The German attack on Russia was met with an outpouring of patriotic enthusiasm that temporarily silenced many of the regime's critics. Even liberal politicians rallied to support the war effort, putting aside their constitutional grievances in the face of foreign invasion. For a brief moment, it appeared that the external threat might heal the internal divisions that had been tearing Russian society apart. Nicholas II, despite his many limitations as a ruler, genuinely believed in his duty to lead the empire through this supreme crisis. In 1915, against the advice of his ministers and his wife, he made the fateful decision to leave St. Petersburg and personally assume command of the Russian armies at the front. This decision, motivated by his sincere desire to share the hardships of his soldiers and to provide visible leadership during the darkest period of the war, would prove to be one of the most disastrous political mistakes in Russian history. The Tsar's departure from the capital left Tsarina Alexandra, as the de facto ruler of the Russian Empire during one of the most critical periods in its history. Officially, she was merely acting as regent in her husband's absence, but in practice, she assumed responsibility for all major domestic policy decisions. This arrangement might have worked if Alexandra had possessed the political skills and popular support necessary for effective leadership. Unfortunately, she possessed neither. Alexandra's approach to governance was shaped by her absolute faith in her divine right to rule and her conviction that opposition to royal authority was inherently treasonous. She had never understood the complex give and take of political negotiation that was necessary for effective governance in a rapidly changing society. Her experience of politics was limited to the intimate family consultations at court, where her word was law and where dissent was virtually unknown. More problematically, Alexandra's approach to the war crisis was fundamentally shaped by her reliance on Rasputin's guidance. As the military situation deteriorated and political pressures mounted, she turned increasingly to her spiritual advisor for counsel on matters that were far beyond his competence or understanding. The peasant from Siberia, whose insights into human psychology had made him valuable as a healer and counselor, was completely unprepared to offer advice on military strategy, industrial policy, or international diplomacy. Rasputin's own attitude toward the war was shaped by a complex mixture of pacifist sentiment, mystical visions, and shrewd political calculation. He had opposed Russian entry into the conflict, reportedly telling the Tsar that war would bring disaster to the dynasty and the empire. When his warnings were ignored, he adopted an increasingly defeatist attitude that put him at odds with the patriotic enthusiasm that characterized most of Russian society during the early war years. His influence over war policy was exercised primarily through his effect on ministerial appointments. Alexandra, convinced that political opposition to her government was motivated by hostility to Rasputin rather than by legitimate policy disagreements, began to view loyalty to her spiritual advisor as the primary qualification for high office. Ministers who expressed skepticism about Rasputin's role were dismissed and replaced by men whose primary qualification was their willingness to tolerate or even collaborate with a controversial holy man. This led to what historians have called the ministerial leapfrog of 1915-1916, a period during which Russia went through 4 different prime ministers, 3 different ministers of war, and 3 different ministers of the interior. Each change was motivated not by policy considerations or administrative competence, but by the complex dynamics of court intrigue surrounding Rasputin's position. The result was a complete breakdown in governmental continuity at the very moment when Russia most needed stable and competent leadership. The most notorious example of Rasputin's influence over ministerial appointments was his role in the promotion of Boris Sturmer to the position of prime minister in early 1916. Sturmer, an elderly and incompetent bureaucrat whose primary qualification was his willingness to collaborate with Rasputin, became the symbol of everything that was wrong with Russian governance during the war years. His appointment was widely seen as evidence that the empire was being governed not by the Tsar or even by the Tsarina, but by a drunken peasant whose judgment was fundamentally unreliable. Even more damaging were the rumors that Rasputin was actively working to undermine the Russian war effort. His known opposition to the conflict, combined with his mysterious contacts with various political figures, led to widespread speculation that he was in contact with German agents and was working to negotiate a separate peace that would benefit enemy interests. These accusations were almost certainly false, but they gained credibility because of the general atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that surrounded Rasputin's activities. The German spy allegations were particularly damaging because they seemed to confirm the worst fears about foreign influence over Russian policy. Alexandra's German birth, which had always been a source of suspicion, became a major political liability once Russia was at war with Germany. Critics suggested that the Empress was torn between loyalty to her adopted country and sympathy for her homeland, and that Rasputin was somehow involved in this treasonous divided loyalty. The military disasters of 1915 and 1916 provided additional fuel for the critics of Rasputin's influence. As Russian armies suffered devastating defeats and retreated across vast stretches of territory, public opinion began to turn against the government with unprecedented intensity. The terrible casualties, the economic hardships, and the apparent incompetence of military leadership created a climate of anger and desperation that made even the most extreme accusations against the government seem plausible. In this atmosphere of crisis and recrimination, Rasputin became a convenient scapegoat for all of Russia's military and political failures. Opposition politicians, military leaders, and even members of the imperial family began to argue that the empire's problems could be traced directly to the malign influence of the Mad Monk. The logic was simple and appealing. Remove Rasputin, and Russia's fortunes would improve. This scapegoating was both unfair and politically dangerous. While Rasputin's influence was certainly harmful to the effectiveness of Russian governance, the empire's problems ran much deeper than the presence of one controversial advisor. The fundamental weaknesses of the autocratic system, the massive challenges of fighting a modern war with a backward economy, and the growing social tensions that had been building for decades, could not be solved by eliminating a single individual. Nevertheless, the focus on Rasputin as the source of all problems served the political needs of various opposition groups who were reluctant to attack the institution of monarchy directly. By concentrating their criticism on the Mad Monk, they could appear patriotic and loyal while actually undermining the foundations of the entire system. The campaign against Rasputin became, in effect, a campaign against the competence and legitimacy of autocratic government itself. The international dimensions of the Rasputin scandal became particularly problematic as Russia's relationship with its Western allies deteriorated. British and French officials, who were desperately trying to keep Russia in the war despite its military setbacks, became increasingly concerned about the political stability of their ally. Reports about Rasputin's influence over Russian policy were seen as evidence that Russia might be unreliable as a partner in the fight against Germany. These international concerns were reflected in the diplomatic correspondence of the period, which reveals growing alarm among Russia's allies about the direction of Russian domestic policy. The British ambassador, Sir George Buchanan, repeatedly warned his government about the dangers posed by Rasputin's continued influence, while French officials began to question whether Russia would be able to maintain its commitment to the war effort. The domestic political crisis reached its peak in the autumn of 1916, when opposition politicians began to speak openly about the need for dramatic changes in government policy. The most famous expression of this opposition came in a speech by Vladimir Purishkevich in the Duma, in which he directly attacked Rasputin's influence and called for his removal from court. This speech, delivered in the parliament that the Tsar had been forced to create after the 1905 revolution, marked the first time that a major political figure had openly challenged the royal family's relationship with their controversial advisor. Even more ominous were the stirrings of opposition within the imperial family itself. Grand Duke Nicholas, the Tsar's uncle and former commander-in-chief, was known to be deeply concerned about Rasputin's influence and its effect on the dynasty's reputation. Other members of the extended royal family began to express similar concerns, creating unprecedented tensions within the usually united Romanov clan. The cumulative effect of these various pressures was to create a situation in which Rasputin's continued presence at court became politically unsustainable. By late 1916, it was clear to virtually everyone, except Alexandra herself, that the holy man's influence had become more damaging than beneficial to the imperial family. The question was no longer whether he would have to go, but how his removal could be accomplished without creating an even greater political crisis. The answer to that question would come in the form of a conspiracy involving some of the most prominent figures in Russian society, men who believed that only Rasputin's death could save the empire from complete collapse. Their plot would succeed in eliminating the Mad Monk, but it would prove to be too little, too late to save the dynasty that had become so fatally identified with his controversial presence. Chapter 7. The Conspiracy. Death of the Mad Monk as 1916 drew to a close. The patience of Rasputin's most powerful enemies finally reached its breaking point. The disastrous military campaigns, the revolving door of incompetent ministers, and the growing certainty that Russia was heading toward complete collapse had convinced a small group of aristocrats that only the most drastic action could save the empire. They would murder the man they held responsible for the dynasty's troubles, believing that his death would somehow restore the monarchy's lost prestige and effectiveness. The conspiracy that formed around this desperate plan brought together three men who represented different aspects of Russian elite society, united only by their shared conviction that Rasputin had to die. The leader of the group was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest and most glamorous figures in Russian society. Heir to a fortune that made him richer than many sovereign princes, Yusupov possessed the resources, the social connections, and the personal charisma necessary to organize and execute such an audacious plot. Prince Felix was a complex figure whose motivations for joining the conspiracy were as much personal as political. A man of extraordinary beauty and refined aesthetic sensibilities, he had spent much of his youth in the decadent social circles of St. Petersburg and Paris, where he had developed a reputation for sexual ambiguity and theatrical excess. Some historians have suggested that his hatred of Rasputin was partly motivated by jealousy over the holy man's influence with women, who might otherwise have been attracted to the prince himself. The second conspirator was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the imperial family whose participation in the plot gave it a legitimacy that it would not otherwise have possessed. As the Tsar's cousin and one of the most eligible bachelors in European high society, Dmitry represented the younger generation of Romanovs who had become increasingly frustrated with the direction of the dynasty under Nicholas II's weak leadership. Dmitry's motivations were primarily political and dynastic. He genuinely believed that Rasputin's continued influence was destroying the reputation of the imperial family and undermining the foundations of monarchical government in Russia. As someone who stood to inherit a position of significant responsibility within the royal family, he felt a personal obligation to act when the reigning Tsar seemed incapable of addressing the crisis himself. The third major conspirator was Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician whose fierce patriotism and monarchist convictions had led him to conclude that the dynasty could only be saved through the elimination of its most controversial advisor. A member of the Duma and a powerful orator, Purishkevich brought to the conspiracy the perspective of someone who understood the broader political implications of Rasputin's influence on public opinion and governmental effectiveness. Purishkevich's involvement was particularly significant because it demonstrated that opposition to Rasputin had spread beyond the narrow circles of court society to include representatives of the broader Russian political establishment. His participation in the plot suggested that the conspiracy enjoyed support among conservative politicians who might normally be expected to support the throne unconditionally. The plan they developed was elaborate, theatrical, and ultimately reflected the amateur nature of the conspirators despite their high social positions. Rather than simply arranging for Rasputin to be shot or stabbed in some dark alley, they decided to lure him to Yusupov's palace under false pretenses and to kill him there, in a controlled environment where they could manage the aftermath of their crime. The bait they chose reveals a great deal about their understanding of Rasputin's psychology and appetites. Yusupov would invite the holy man to his palace, ostensibly to meet the prince's wife, Irina, who is renowned as one of the most beautiful women in Russian society. The invitation would suggest the possibility of a sexual encounter, playing on Rasputin's well-known weakness for attractive women and his apparent belief that no woman could resist his charms. To make the deception more convincing, Yusupov spent several weeks cultivating a relationship with Rasputin, visiting him at his apartment and gradually building the trust that would be necessary to lure him to the palace. During these preliminary meetings, the prince played the role of a spiritual seeker, asking Rasputin for guidance on personal and philosophical matters while carefully observing his habits and preferences. These preparatory meetings provided Yusupov with insights into Rasputin's character that would prove crucial to the success of their plan. He noted the holy man's vanity, his susceptibility to flattery from members of the aristocracy, and his apparent inability to recognize danger even when it came from sources that should have aroused his suspicion. Most importantly, he confirmed Rasputin's legendary capacity for alcohol, which would become a key element in their murder plot. The actual murder took place on the night of December 29th to 30th, 1916, in the basement of the Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal. The conspirators had prepared the basement room with meticulous care, furnishing it with expensive furniture and religious icons to create an atmosphere that would seem appropriate for entertaining an important guest. More sinisterly, they had also prepared an assortment of poisoned foods and drinks. Having decided that poison would be the safest and most discreet method of assassination, Rasputin arrived at the palace around midnight, dressed in his finest clothes and clearly anticipating an evening of pleasure. Yusupov met him at a side entrance and led him down to the basement room, explaining that Irina would join them shortly, but was currently entertaining other guests upstairs. To maintain this fiction, other conspirators moved around the upper floors of the palace, playing music and engaging in loud conversation to suggest the presence of a party. What followed was one of the most bizarre murder scenes in history. Yusupov offered his guests tea and cakes, all of which had been heavily laced with cyanide. To the conspirators' amazement and growing horror, Rasputin consumed large quantities of the poison refreshments without showing any signs of distress. He remained alert, conversational, and apparently completely unaffected by what should have been a lethal dose of poison. Modern medical experts have suggested several possible explanations for the failure of the poison to take effect. Rasputin's legendary capacity for alcohol might have built up a tolerance that extended to other toxic substances. Alternatively, the conspirators might have used stale cyanide that had lost its potency, or they might have prepared the poison incorrectly. Some accounts suggest that Rasputin's stomach problems, which were well documented, might have affected the absorption of the toxic substance. Whatever the explanation, the failure of the poison threw the conspirators into panic. They had expected Rasputin to collapse within minutes, allowing them to dispose of his body quietly and to establish alibis for themselves. Instead, he continued to eat and drink while engaging them in animated conversation about politics, religion, and his relationship with the imperial family. As the hours passed and the poison continued to show no effect, Yusupov became increasingly desperate. Around 2:30 in the morning, he excused himself and went upstairs to consult with his fellow conspirators. They decided that more direct action was necessary, and Yusupov returned to the basement carrying a revolver that had been blessed by the Grand Duke Dmitri as if it were some kind of religious relic, claiming that he wanted to show Rasputin the beautiful crucifix. Yusupov positioned himself behind his guest and fired a single shot into his back. Rasputin collapsed immediately, and the conspirators gathered around what they assumed was his corpse. Dr. Lazavert, a physician who had joined the conspiracy to help with the medical aspects of the murder, examined the body and pronounced Rasputin dead, but their nightmare was far from over. As the conspirators began to discuss the disposal of the body, Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. According to Yusupov's later account, the supposed corpse rose to its feet with superhuman strength and attacked the prince, tearing an epaulette from his military uniform before staggering toward the door. The scene that followed was pure pandemonium, as the terrified conspirators watched their victim attempt to escape from the palace. Perishkevich, who had remained upstairs during the initial shooting, heard the commotion and rushed outside to find Rasputin crawling across the palace courtyard, blood streaming from his wounds but still alive and attempting to reach the street. The politician fired several shots, at least 2 of which struck Rasputin in the back, finally bringing him down. Even then, their ordeal was not complete. When they dragged the body back into the palace, Rasputin showed signs of life once more, prompting Yusupov to beat him savagely with a rubber club until he was certain that their victim was finally dead. The entire murder had taken nearly 4 hours and had required multiple forms of assault to accomplish. What should have been a simple poisoning, the disposal of the body was carried out with the same mixture of careful planning and amateur execution that had characterized the entire enterprise. The conspirators wrapped Rasputin's corpse in a curtain, loaded it into a car, and drove to a bridge over the Neva River. There, in the early hours of December 30th, they pushed the body through a hole in the ice, weighting it down with chains to ensure that it would not surf. The fall of the Romanovs, death of Rasputin, rather than restoring stability to the Russian Empire, seemed to unleash the very forces of chaos that his presence had somehow held in check. In the 2 months that followed his murder, the political situation in Russia deteriorated with stunning rapidity, as if the Mad Monk's death had broken some invisible barrier that had been holding back the tide of revolution. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the depth of the imperial family's dependence on their controversial advisor. Alexandra, devastated by the loss of the man she had considered her family's divinely appointed protector, retreated into a world of mystical speculation and political paranoia. She became convinced that Rasputin's murder was only the first step in a broader conspiracy aimed at destroying the Romanov dynasty, and her behavior became increasingly erratic and disconnected from political reality. The Serena's grief manifested itself in ways that further damaged the monarchy's already precarious position. She insisted on elaborate memorial services for Rasputin, treating him as if he had been a member of the royal family rather than a peasant advisor. She spoke openly about her belief that his spirit continued to guide and protect the imperial family, making statements that shocked even her closest supporters and provided additional ammunition for the regime's critics. More damaging still was Alexandra's reaction to the conspirators who had killed her spiritual guide. She demanded that they be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, apparently oblivious to the political impossibility of such a course of action. When Nicholas proved reluctant to pursue criminal charges against members of his own family and the highest ranks of the aristocracy, she interpreted his hesitation as a betrayal of Rasputin's memory and a sign of weakness that would invite further attacks on the dynasty. Nicholas himself was caught in an impossible position. His wife's demands for justice conflicted with the political reality that prosecuting Rasputin's killers would only create additional scandal and controversy. The conspirators, particularly Prince Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry, were being hailed as heroes by significant segments of Russian society, including many who had previously been loyal supporters of the monarchy. To punish them would risk alienating these crucial constituencies at a time when the regime desperately needed all the support it could get. The Tsar's solution was a compromise that satisfied no one and further demonstrated the weakness of his position. Rather than ordering criminal prosecutions, he chose to exile the main conspirators, sending Grand Duke Dmitry to military service in Persia and confining Prince Yusupov to his estates. This punishment was severe enough to anger those who viewed the conspirators as patriots, yet lenient enough to convince Rasputin supporters that justice had not been served. The broader Russian public's reaction to Rasputin's death was complex, and ultimately more damaging to the monarchy than his life had been. While many people were relieved that the scandalous holy man was finally gone, the dramatic circumstances of his murder and the involvement of high-ranking aristocrats in the conspiracy created a sense that the entire political system was spinning out of control. The legend of Rasputin's death, embellished with each retelling, took on supernatural dimensions that seemed to confirm the most superstitious fears about the forces governing Russian politics. Stories circulated about his prophecies regarding the fate of the Romanov family, his supposed predictions about the coming revolution, and his mystical warnings about the consequences of his own murder. Whether these prophecies were genuine or invented after the fact, they contributed to a growing sense that Russia was in the grip of forces beyond human control. The international reaction to Rasputin's assassination was equally problematic for the Russian government. Foreign diplomats and journalists, who had long viewed the Mad Monk as a symbol of Russian political backwardness, now interpreted his murder as evidence of complete governmental breakdown. The idea that Russian aristocrats had resorted to assassination to resolve a political crisis seemed to confirm every negative stereotype about Russian political culture. Russia's wartime allies were particularly concerned about the implications of the political chaos in Petrograd. British and French officials had hoped that Rasputin's removal would lead to more effective Russian participation in the war effort, but instead they found themselves dealing with a government that appeared to be on the verge of complete collapse. Secret diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals growing Allied concern about Russia's ability to continue as an effective partner in the fight against Germany. The military situation continued to deteriorate throughout the winter of 1917, providing additional fuel for the political crisis. Russian armies had suffered devastating losses during the 1916 campaigns, and the country's industrial infrastructure was proving incapable of supporting the massive requirements of modern warfare. Food shortages, transportation breakdowns, and industrial strikes created a climate of desperation that made political upheaval increasingly likely in this atmosphere of crisis. Rasputin's death came to be seen not as the solution to Russia's problems, but as a symbol of the complete breakdown of traditional authority. The fact that members of the imperial family had felt compelled to resort to murder to influence government policy suggested that normal political processes had ceased to function if princes and grand dukes could not achieve their goals through conventional means. What hope was there for ordinary citizens who sought political change? The revolution, when it finally came in February 1917, began not with any organized conspiracy, but with spontaneous, popular demonstrations triggered by food shortages and war weariness. The protesters who filled the streets of Petrograd were not initially calling for the overthrow of the monarchy, but simply for bread and an end to the war. However, the government's inability to respond effectively to these demonstrations revealed the complete erosion of its authority and legitimacy. Nicholas II's reaction to the February Revolution demonstrated how thoroughly Rasputin's death had undermined his confidence and political judgment. The Tsar, who had previously shown at least occasional flashes of decisive leadership, seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the crisis confronting his regime. His attempts to restore order through military force proved ineffective, as even the army units stationed in the capital proved unreliable when ordered to fire on protesters. The final blow came when Nicholas's own generals and government ministers advised him that abdication was the only way to prevent complete chaos and possible foreign invasion. The Tsar, isolated at military headquarters and cut off from reliable information about the situation in the capital, finally accepted their advice and renounced the throne on March 2nd, 1917, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Abdication document itself reflected the peculiar circumstances that had brought the dynasty to this point. Nicholas abdicated not only for himself, but also for his son Alexei, citing the boy's health problems as making him unfit to rule. This decision, while understandable from a personal perspective, violated Russian succession law and created additional legal complications for the transfer of power. The immediate aftermath of the abdication revealed how completely the monarchy had lost the support of Russian society. There were no significant demonstrations in favor of the fallen Tsar, no military units that remained loyal to the crown, and no political groups that called for the restoration of monarchical government. The institution that had seemed so permanent and unshakable just a few years earlier simply disappeared from Russian political life without a trace. Alexandra's reaction to her husband's abdication was a mixture of relief and despair. On one hand, she was glad to be free of the crushing responsibilities of imperial rule that had brought her family so much suffering. On the other hand, she was devastated by what she saw as the complete collapse of everything she had worked to preserve. Her final letters from this period reveal a woman who was struggling to understand how the divine right that she had believed in so completely had proved so fragile. The provisional government that replaced the monarchy made some initial gestures toward treating the imperial family with dignity and respect. However, as the political situation continued to deteriorate and more radical forces gained influence, the ex-Tsar and his family found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. They were initially held under house arrest at their palace at Tsarskoye Selo, but as anti-monarchist sentiment intensified, they were moved to more secure locations further from the capital. The final tragedy of the Romanov family played out in the summer of 1918, when Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were executed by Bolshevik guards in the basement of a house in Ekaterinburg. The circumstances of their deaths were as brutal and chaotic as the political forces that had brought them to that point, ending not only their lives, but also any possibility of monarchical restoration in Russia. The connection between Rasputin's influence and the ultimate fate of the Romanov family has been debated by historians ever since these events occurred. Some argue that the Mad Monk's presence at court was merely a symptom of deeper problems within the autocratic system rather than a cause of the monarchy's downfall. Others maintain that his scandalous behavior and legacy and reflection as we reach the end of this long winter's tale. The snow still falls on the palaces and monuments of what was once Imperial Russia, covering the ruins of a world that seems as distant from our own as ancient Babylon. The story of Grigory Rasputin and his extraordinary influence over the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia remains one of history's most fascinating examples of how personal weakness can intertwine with political catastrophe to produce consequences that reshape the destiny of nations. The immediate aftermath of the Romanov dynasty's collapse seemed to vindicate those who had argued that Rasputin's influence was a symptom of deeper problems within the autocratic system rather than their primary cause. The provisional government that briefly replaced the monarchy proved no more capable of solving Russia's fundamental problems than Nicholas II had been. Within months, they too were swept away by the Bolshevik Revolution, which established a new form of authoritarian rule that would prove even more brutal and oppressive than the old regime. Yet the role that Rasputin played in undermining the moral authority and political effectiveness of the monarchy cannot be dismissed as merely incidental to these larger historical forces. His presence at court created a unique set of vulnerabilities that Russia's enemies were able to exploit with devastating effectiveness. The scandals surrounding his relationship with the imperial family provided the perfect ammunition for those seeking to discredit the entire system of monarchical government. The psychological dimensions of Rasputin's influence reveal important truths about the nature of power and the vulnerabilities of those who wield it. Nicholas and Alexandra's desperate search for help with their son's illness made them susceptible to manipulation by anyone who could offer hope, regardless of the political consequences of their association. Their personal tragedy as parents created a blind spot that prevented them from seeing how their reliance on Rasputin was destroying their effectiveness as rulers. This pattern of personal crisis leading to political disaster has been repeated throughout history, but rarely with such dramatic and well-documented consequences. The intimate details of the imperial family's private life, preserved in their letters and diaries, provide an unusually clear window into the psychological mechanisms that drove their fateful decisions. We can see how their love for their afflicted child gradually overwhelmed their judgment as rulers, leading them to make choices that seemed rational from a personal perspective, but were catastrophic from a political one. Rasputin himself remains an enigmatic figure whose true nature continues to elude definitive assessment. The historical evidence suggests that he was neither the simple peasant mystic his supporters claimed, nor the evil genius his critics portrayed. Instead, he appears to have been a complex individual who possessed genuine gifts for healing and psychological manipulation, combined with an almost complete lack of understanding about the broader implications of his actions. His apparent healing abilities, whatever their source, were real enough to convince desperate parents that he had been sent by divine providence to preserve their son's life. The psychological relief he provided to the imperial family during their darkest moments was genuine and, from their perspective, invaluable. The tragedy was that neither Rasputin nor his royal patrons understood how his presence in their lives was being perceived by the outside world, and how this perception was undermining the foundations of their political authority. The sexual scandals that surrounded Rasputin's life in St. Petersburg reveal the complex relationship between private behavior and public authority in pre-revolutionary Russian society. His nocturnal adventures, while shocking by conventional standards, were not unique among members of the Russian elite. What made them particularly damaging was the contrast between his role as a religious advisor to the imperial family and his reputation as a libertine and debauchee. This contradiction struck at the heart of traditional Russian religious and political culture, which had always maintained a close connection between moral authority and political legitimacy. The idea that the Tsar and Tsarina were receiving spiritual guidance from a man whose private life was characterized by drunkenness and sexual excess seemed to many Russians to represent a fundamental betrayal of everything the monarchy was supposed to embody. The international dimensions of the Rasputin scandal demonstrated how quickly domestic political controversies could undermine a country's standing in the broader world. Russia's allies and enemies alike saw the Mad Monk as a symbol of Russian political backwardness and governmental incompetence. His influence over the imperial family seemed to confirm every negative stereotype about Russian political culture and provided propaganda opportunities that Russia's enemies exploited with considerable success the role that gender played in the Rasputin scandal reveals important aspects of early 20th century attitudes toward women in positions of authority. Much of the criticism directed at the imperial family focused specifically on Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin, reflecting contemporary assumptions about women's supposed susceptibility to mystical influence and sexual manipulation. The idea that the empire was being governed by an empress under the influence of a peasant lover was particularly offensive to traditional Russian sensibilities about proper gender roles. This gendered aspect of the scandal was compounded by Alexandra's foreign origins, which made her suspect in the eyes of many Russians even before her association with Rasputin began. The combination of her German birth and her apparent dependence on a controversial Russian mystic created a perfect storm of xenophobic and misogynistic sentiment that proved impossible for the monarchy to overcome. The assassination of Rasputin by members of the Russian aristocracy marked a crucial turning point in the monarchy's relationship with its traditional supporters. The fact that princes and grand dukes felt compelled to resort to murder to influence government policy demonstrated the complete breakdown of normal political processes within the imperial system. The conspirators' belief that killing Rasputin would somehow restore the monarchy's effectiveness proved tragically wrong, but their desperation was a clear indication of how serious the crisis had become. The legend of Rasputin that emerged after his death proved to be almost as damaging to the monarchy as his life had been. Stories about his supernatural powers, his prophecies about the fate of the Romanov family, and the extraordinary circumstances of his murder created a mythology that seemed to confirm the most superstitious fears about the forces governing Russian politics. This legend, embellished with each retelling, contributed to a sense that Russia was in the grip of dark, supernatural forces that ordinary political solutions could not address. The rapid collapse of the Romanov dynasty in the months following Rasputin's death suggests that his influence, while significant, was indeed more a symptom of deeper problems than their primary cause. The monarchy's inability to adapt to the challenges of modern warfare, industrial development, and social change would probably have led to its downfall, even without the scandals surrounding the Mad Monk. However, his presence at court certainly accelerated this process and made it more dramatic and violent than it might otherwise have been. The ultimate tragedy of the Rasputin affair lies in the fact that it represented a collision between human compassion and political necessity that proved impossible to resolve. Nicholas and Alexandra's love for their afflicted son was genuine and admirable, and their willingness to seek help from unconventional sources reflected a parental devotion that commands respect even today. The problem was that their personal needs as parents conflicted irreconcilably with their public responsibilities as rulers dot in seeking to preserve their child's life. They inadvertently endangered their dynasty's survival in trying to maintain secrecy about their son's condition. They created an atmosphere of mystery and speculation that allowed the most damaging rumors to flourish unchecked. And placing their trust in a man who could provide immediate comfort, they ignored the long-term consequences of their association for their political authority and legitimacy. The story of Rasputin and the Romanovs ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of personal solutions to political problems. The imperial family's crisis was both intensely personal and unavoidably public, requiring them to balance their private needs against their public responsibilities in ways that proved impossible to sustain. Their failure to find this balance contributed to one of the most dramatic political collapses in modern history. As we conclude this examination of these extraordinary events, it is worth reflecting on the lessons they offer for our own understanding of power, authority, and the relationship between private life and public responsibility. The basic human needs that drove Nicholas and Alexandra to seek Rasputin's help, the desire to protect their children, to find hope in desperate circumstances, to believe that supernatural intervention might solve problems that human effort could not address, remain. As powerful today as they were a century ago, the technology and political systems of our modern world are vastly different from those of Imperial Russia, but the fundamental human emotions and motivations that shaped the Rasputin affair remain constant. Leaders today still face the challenge